Hey, it's Sigrun with the Universal Pagan Temple, and we are here with the entire review of Pastor Lucas Miles's book on Pagan Threat. And, this might be the longest video that I've ever done on this channel. And we've just surpassed our 12-year anniversary on this channel. This is the type of video I thought I'd never have to do because I thought as a collective, we were past this point with this type of fear-mongering. But I guess history is attempting to repeat itself, or the powers that be are attempting to, put this target on the pagans' back. Now, in this book, Pastor Lucas Miles, he's evangelical. He hurls every insult and assumption at pagans that we, as pagans, we've all heard this before, and even more. He's really keen on trying to start another satanic panic, it feels like, with this book. And the sales and the numbers on this book you could see on Amazon. It's a bestseller. And in our current political climate, it's cause for concern. If this was a nothing burger of a book, I wouldn't be bringing this up. Now, his mental gymnastics in this book, he links paganism with leftist ideology, and it's just dangerous and intellectually dishonest. And he's made no attempt to talk about conservative pagans because we're all very much individuals, different. We all have our viewpoints, but we're all pagan. He's chosen to show us in the worst possible light possible. And if he actually looked into paganism without a biased mindset, he might have actually have seen that we are very different from each other, but we still have one thing in common. We're all pagan or witches. And perhaps, what thing that scares me is that perhaps he did see, a conservative pagan group here or there online, but he chose not to put it in because it didn't fit the narrative that he's trying to, preach to people, that paganism is a threat and needs to be stopped. Now, luckily, I've already seen some of the Amazon reviews coming in, and there are some Christians calling this out for what it is, as being fear-mongering, bringing us back to the satanic panic of the 80s and mid-90s. But I'm here to expose this book for what it is for the pagan community, whether you label yourself as liberal or conservative, because this is going to impact us all with, the apparent sales of this book, because this book was aimed at conservative Christians, and they're going to pick up this book. And because Lucas Miles doesn't differentiate between liberal pagans and conservative pagans, and chose to show all the liberal pagans as being, demonic, evil, and every negative ism in the book, all of these conservative Christians, they're going to have a much more negative view of paganism thanks to this book. And even those Christians with an already negative view on paganism, or, say, astrology girlies, it's just going to be a confirmation bias for them. The foreword is written by the late Charlie Kirk. And I'm not going to dissect it too much, given that he was tragically taken out in a very cowardly act. I will touch upon, he says, the individual human life was of no importance to pagans. And unfortunately, there are plenty of pagans out there that are upset that he was taken in such a manner, especially in front of his children. This is one pagan that doesn't see assassinating somebody for their freedom of speech as being just. It was totally an evil act. I condemn it, no matter who or they were behind assassinating. It was a terrible act, but we pagans do value human life. That much is for certain. Okay, and on to what Lucas Miles has to say in the rest of the book. In his introduction, he states the connection between woke ideology and paganism is not merely a coincidence, but a natural progression. Behind the emphasis on identity politics, intersectionality, and radical inclusivity within wokeism lies century-old pagan ideologies. As such, it could be stated that wokeism is not new, but rather the modern fruition of ancient paganism. What has appeared politically and secular is spiritual. Oh boy. That's just a lot of things to dissect even in there, but we're going to continue. He also states, quite frankly, the church wasn't ready for this. Working under the assumption that paganism was dead, Christians failed to take seriously the incremental reawakening of false ideology and heretical ideas that was taking place before our eyes, and at the time, even under our steeples. Well, Christians have a very difficult time, especially evangelicals, identifying wrongs within their own ideology, their own preaching. They don't realize a lot of the times the way that they talk to people is very combative, aggressive, and their apologetics, and he even goes to apologetics in this book. It is just very off-putting for somebody who feels like an outsider, and they may claim to, we're welcoming everybody, but no, that bottom energy, low frequency energy of, excluding people for just being who they are is still there. And a lot of pagans in America come out of these Christian churches, whether it's evangelical, Protestant, Catholic, you name it. They all have similar experiences with Christianity at a young age that just, completely turned them off from the religion. It's either one, through studying Christianity and they decide this isn't for me anymore, or two, it's because of how they were treated by Christians, even in their family. And sometimes it's a combination of both. Now, he does go over various pagan paths. He gives a paragraph to each, or sometimes a little more. But oddly enough, he goes over Lilith and Lucifer, earth goddesses, alien worship, Christian paganism, feminism, and transgender pagans. And he directly links transgenderism to paganism, even though most transgenders I've encountered, they're not pagan, they're atheist. So I'm not sure where the connection is just kind of silly. There are transgender pagans, I know, but just making that connection's just kind of, it doesn't stick. At one point, he starts to go after gender, feminism, and starts ranting about leftist and hermetic tradition. And he makes the reference to globalism. And this is always hilarious to me when Christians start ranting about globalism and how it's a threat, when in actuality, Christianity was the first form of globalism. I mean, look at the Catholic Church and look at what they did. Look at everywhere Catholicism has spread to. Everywhere Protestant Christianity, including evangelical Christianity, has spread to. Look at everything it's impacted. Look at Christian Zionism. Look at the war and the death that it has brought upon the world. And, the repercussions of Muslims that, their countries are bombed and they start going into Europe and they're not culturally compatible with European life, and they start committing crimes, raping women, and it's just awful. And the excuse of Christians is, oh, it's not, Christianity isn't globalism. No, it is. It is, and I'm sorry. You can cope all you want, but it is. It is globalism. Then he starts to go off about witchcraft and abortion. But if you look at American culture, which has been so influenced by Christianity, a lot of women, especially in the Christian world, have had a negative viewpoint of motherhood because of purity culture. They grow up viewing sex as being dirty, and they fear pregnancy and often have trouble with sex in their married life. Within paganism, we view motherhood as being sacred. Many of our gods and goddesses are focused around fertility, and we have more mother goddesses than you can count. Gods and goddesses that protect children, protect women during childbirth, and it's kind of like they call us godless heathens, but we can't even count all of our gods on our, you get 10 fingers and 10 toes. You if you got more than 20, yeah, you're not really godless. Of course, they refer to godlessness as, oh, not accepting Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. Oh, really? That again? Anyway, let's carry on. He wanks about Christianity being a religion of freedom and accuses pagans of having groupthink, or what he says, hive mind. But when in actuality, paganism is for an independent soul, and we are all vastly different from one another, even though we all have one common thread among us. And I have never met a Christian that didn't have groupthink on one form or another. There's a lot of examples that I can give, and the one that comes into mind when I'm reading this book was the Satanic Panic, and I've already mentioned it once in this video, but the Satanic Panic was definitely an episode of group psychosis, hive mind, and this is something that has to be addressed within the Christian community, is getting away from this hive mind mentality. Okay, he starts to talk about this topic when he's talking about techno-paganism. And then he says, the notion of a hive brain isn't just futuristic, it's frighteningly pagan. Throughout history, pagan systems sought to obliterate individual identity, merging the self into a greater cosmic order. Well, I got something to tell you. You get 20 pagans in a room and you're going to have 40 different traditions. 20 witches in a room and you're going to have 40 different traditions or even more. We're all very individuals, varying degrees of individuality within us. We've all have our stories, but then we have this common thread amongst us that, okay, we're all pagan, we all worship similar deities, and then we get into comparative mythology. And that's really where paganism shines, is that we can all sit down, like I've said before in a video, that one scene of Conan the Barbarian, where Conan is sitting around the campfire with the thief character, and he asks the thief, oh, which gods do you worship? And they have a little bit of banter, but it's nothing too aggressive. And the entire title of the book, Pagan Threat. Now, paganism isn't a centralized religion like Catholicism. We don't have a pagan pope. Certain paths and traditions do have somebody that's at the head. I could kind of think of a ATC, Aquarian Tabernacle Church, but they don't command all the Wiccans in the world. No, that's the beauty of paganism, because it's decentralized, and we can be as individual as we want to be. And there's no, you could get kicked out of a coven or a group, but then you could just go join another one. And then there's a whole thing about the degree system and the initiation system within Wicca and other magical traditions, where if you have a third degree in one tradition, that's not going to transfer over to another tradition. And also the other goofy thing about labeling paganism as a threat, just in the wording, is, not only are we not centralized, but if we're not centralized, we're decentralized. And that means that we don't have a huge amount of money to start making, start buying politicians, to start influencing elections. It's just so goofy. Now, if you've got the Kindle version of this book, he includes sources and with links in them. And I was actually starting to go through some of these links. And he starts to talk about certain Twitter posts with the most common criticisms of Christianity. And I'll even show some of them here, in that the ones that he's pointed out, one of them is definitely a pagan, with some negative opinions about Christianity. Okay. But then he points out to one that's just has something negative to say about Christianity, but they're not pagan. I went to their profile. This person was not a pagan. So he's just assuming, because somebody has a negative opinion on Christianity, on Jesus, that they must be pagan, which is just so dishonest to just put in your book. And maybe I went too far with that one to look into it, and I'm kind of like shocked that he went that far himself. Okay, so he goes into new apologetics for Christians to use in the face of paganism. Okay. Christian apologetics are just gaslighting at worst, and insincere at best for anybody that's had any sort of traumatic experience, either within the church or just dealing with Christians in their life. I've been through it. I know. I've heard other people's stories. They've been through it. And it's just, we hear a Christian apologetic, and it's like you hear one, you've heard all of them. And it's just, it's at the point where people say, just get away from me, to Christians. Now, he goes on to state, for today's spiritually confused generation, however, this innate knowledge of God is often buried beneath layers of false ideology, casting him as distant, indifferent, or even oppressive. I've got news for you. Our natural state is paganism. Paganism is as old as mankind, and it will be here long after Christianity has come and gone. We know our gods and goddesses because they are everywhere and everything. Christianity cannot defeat paganism. And they cannot. It's like they can't destroy our gods because they cannot destroy the sun, the moon, the planets, the earth, the mountains, the water, our rivers, the fields. They may poison the environment, but, nature will prevail. And when the last Christian has died off, and it's just, the churches just remain, nature will reclaim those churches. And this is just a losing battle for Christians to go after pagans, because, you take the witchcraft traditions, those survived as a spoken tradition, a verbal tradition, oral tradition, rather. That's the word. As an oral tradition. And, various stories within our mythologies have survived the test of time. Or, in the Enlightenment period, say when Egyptian hieroglyphics were finally able to be translated. They were translated, and those stories, came to us. And, you look at Snorri Sturluson, who, while he may have been a monk, he still felt it was important enough to save the poetic tradition for Iceland. He goes on to say, after he actually acknowledges some of the damage that Christians have done to people with their preaching, who now reject Jesus Christ, these pagan spiritual systems may provide a fleeting sense of empowerment or control, but they cannot satisfy the deepest human longing. That longing can only be fulfilled by the goodness of God who created us. Well, if you burned your hand on a hot stove, why would you go back and touch it again? Christianity cannot exist without control. And since paganism is decentralized, in our rituals, you come of your own free will. If you go to a group ritual or if you do ritual on your own, you worship the gods on your own, you are doing it of your own free will. It's 100% free will with no fear of damnation or, if you don't accept Odin as your god, it doesn't matter. He's not going to get pissed off. If you don't accept, Hathor as your goddess of love, it's nothing bad's going to happen to you. The gods want to be involved in your life, but they're not going to force it. It's actually a very healthy relationship. As Christianity cannot exist without control, we go back and we see, how did we get to this point? Well, Christianity was pushed upon pagan peoples not only through the sword and by force, but through, peer pressure and financial coercion. I mean, we could go look back at the COVID epidemic and the forcing of the vaccines upon people, get the vaccine or get fired from your job. And the Christians were very much against this. And it's the irony that they were against this, but this is one of the ways they use to force people to convert. And they do this all the time in third world countries, even to this day. They have to force their ideology on them some way, even if it's helping them. He also goes into talking about justice and judgment. He says, this understanding of God's goodness leads us directly into a vital contrast: how Christianity, unlike pagan belief systems, provides the only coherent and satisfying foundation for true justice. He doesn't understand how many systems of justice existed before Christianity. You can even look at gods and goddesses of justice, judgment, divine order, like Ma'at of the Egyptian pantheon, which is literally divine order, versus, and then on the opposite is divine chaos. And then he's got like a chapter within a chapter here, the way things ought to be, where he starts to rant about heaven. And then he says, well, I've spent most of this book exposing the dangers that pagan practices and ideology impose upon society. It's important to recognize that many of the pursuits behind these practices reflect real human desires that ultimately point to our need for something greater than ourselves. But here's where paganism deteriorates. It may touch on legitimate longing, but it offers no real answers, only counterfeits, distortions, and empty promises that lead people further from the truth rather than towards it. Christianity does not simply acknowledge these longings, it fulfills them in the only way that is true and lasting. I'm sorry for the voice, I can't help myself. The liberation that paganism offers is rebellion masquerading as freedom, while Christ offers true freedom through redemption. Oh, I might continue with this voice, I don't know, it's just getting so goofy. Then he says, paganism leads people in circles, forever searching, but never finding, always chasing, but never arriving. Christ alone is the answer. Then he goes into this comparison chart of pagan practices in belief versus Christian belief, further showing his bias. I might address this in another video. And then he also rants about two types of freedom. Ultimately, what pagan practices and philosophies offer are incomplete, fleeting answers to the deepest human longings, the desire of liberation, identity, empowerment, and eternity. And then he makes another statement, and this is just not applicable to any pagan that I've ever met. Now, contrast this with the pagan vision of freedom, a vision that insists on the highest form of liberation lies in the ability to become one's own god. I haven't met a pagan that is keen on becoming a god. That, I don't know where he's pulling that from. You know, there are some people that do have some delusions out there, but becoming a god, that is just, yeah, it again, with this book, he is just showing paganism in the worst possible light. And it is just a great crime against a true religious minority across the world. Is he's showing paganism in the worst possible way, and he's doing this on purpose. And then he goes on, this is where paganism, with its rejection of moral absolutes, becomes a real threat to any nation, especially America. The founders understood that true freedom could not exist without a moral foundation. A society built on unchecked liberty, like the pagan version of freedom, and he doesn't understand that Christian morals come from pagan ones. You can look into the 42 negative confessions of the ancient Egyptians. That was, in the Papyrus of Anai, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, where you basically go before each god and you make statements of, your morality. And 9 out of those 42, I believe, it's like 8 or 9, are about theft. And, there's also ones about murder there, and being angry without cause. And, the ancient Greeks, the Romans, they all had their morality that had, a profound effect upon the Western world. We wouldn't have democracy without the Greeks. We wouldn't have modern medicine without the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Greeks. We wouldn't even have our medical terminology if it weren't for the Romans and the Greeks. And a lot of, our current practices in the Western world, especially, the Europeans that came over from Europe, even Scandinavia, you can look at, a lot of them still hold on to their pagan traditions. They brought them over to America, their pagan traditions, their pagan morals, really. They're not entirely Christian. It just came from paganism first. Pagans were here first. And the Christians borrowed quite a bit from paganism. And then he states, the truth is that Christianity offers a radically different kind of freedom, one that is not about ascension through one's own strength, but about surrender. Okay, the word surrender is a cope. We all know this. It's a cope for submission. It's kind of getting into the whole Islam thing, where that's about submission as well. Okay, in another part, he states, ultimately, if this trend continues, Christian persecution in America and other Western nations seems inevitable. The erosion of religious freedoms, the criminalization of traditional beliefs, and the societal rejection of core Christian values are not distant possibilities, but present realities. As the cultural frontlines grow more hostile, Christians must brace themselves for escalating tensions and increasing opposition, politically and spiritually. Where if you didn't want this, you shouldn't have written this book. Seriously. I know this is your freedom of speech, but going after pagans is the wrong choice. Go after the Christian Zionists. Go after the Muslims. I know we're easy targets for you. Knock it off. You may claim that you're persecuted. Well, geez, you've been doing it to us for a very long time. You've been identifying those who aren't even pagan as pagan for persecution. Terrible. Terrible. Okay, towards the end of the book, he starts outlining what Christians should do to beef up Christianity against the pagan threat. He goes on to say, the final battle plan. Sorry, I have to be silly with that one. As we stand on the precipice of this cultural shift, what Arthur Eric Metexas refers to as America's third existential crisis, the time has come to put into action a comprehensive, decisive strategy that not only defends the truth, but also brings to light into the darkness of the growing totalitarian pagan uprising. To accomplish this, we must focus on the essential steps needed to combat the rise of paganism so we can fortify believers' faith, strategically, spread the gospel, and reclaim the public square for God's glory. Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe if you want a Christian theocracy, maybe America's not for you. Okay, then he goes into his battle plan, and it is, let's see here, how many? 7 steps. 7's a magical number. Deepen discipleship rooted in primary Christian doctrine. Okay. Develop a roadmap for Christian engagement in politics and the public square. Oh boy. Where he says we must prioritize supporting leaders who will stand strong against the forces of paganism, secularism, and moral decline. We need to encourage Christian involvement in politics, not as a means of gaining power, but as a means of bringing God's truth into the public arena. And I'm sorry, the more and more I read of this guy's writing, I have to use a silly voice because it's a way for me to cope with this amount of propaganda. I've got to make a funny out of it. Okay, so then he goes into leverage technology for the advancement of the gospel, where he says training digital evangelists. Okay, so we're pretty much going to get more harassment online from Christians. Well, we're pretty much used to it at this point, but it's just going to be even more so. So if you're public and you're a content creator about paganism or witchcraft or Wicca, expect more of this BS. Redouble efforts to reach today's youth. Okay, so meaning there's going to be more incidents of inappropriate touching. Yeah, Christians have a real problem with that. Implement a practical strategy for evangelism. Number 6, directly combat false doctrines and pagan ideologies. And then he goes to talk about prayer warriors, and not being aware that prayer is a lower form of magic, because magic is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. And number 7, renew interest in spiritual gifts. Every denomination should emphasize the significance of spiritual gifts and teach believers how to operate them effectively and sober-mindedly. From prophecy to healing, from wisdom to discernment, these gifts are crucial for engaging with and responding to the spiritual needs of the culture around us. He also says, now that the conservatives are in power, mainly Christians are rallying. Then he says, the right road forward involves increasing religious freedoms, extending favor to churches and Christian organizations, and platforming Christian voices